Welcome, everyone, to an honest conversation on the persistent issue of anti-Semitism and the historical rise of hatred towards this tiny group of people. Please like, comment, share, subscribe below if you think these conversations are important. I started these talks as part of a research for a documentary on the topic. And instead of assuming everyone was wrong and I was right, I assumed that I might be wrong and there may be others out there who are right. And I wanted to ask people why they feel the way they do about the Jews. And I wanted to invite people to challenge the views of Kabbalah as I heard them from Dr. Laitman. Today, we're in for a special conversation since my guest today is an internationally recognized philologist, a controversial investigator of the Holocaust and racial matters, and a historical revisionist with a particular penchant for all things Greek, including their influence on Jewish thought and Jewish religion. Hello, Dr. Lindner.
Yeah, thank you.
Pleasure to have you.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here.
It's an opportunity in this talk today to explore the relationship between Jews and the ancient world and try to shed light on what's happening today by looking at what was going on over 2,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I actually wanted to start with Dr. Laitman, PhD in cybernetics and the foremost authority on the science of Kabbalah, and ask if you could perhaps give us a historic overview of Kabbalah. Where did it originate? How did it evolve? And who are the Jewish people in all of this? Perhaps if we understand what Kabbalah is and how it views reality, we'll understand better its explanation of anti-Semitism. So, Dr. Laitman.
Well, the origin of the wisdom of Kabbalah goes back to approximately 6,000 years ago. The one who discovered this approach to the higher general force of nature, his name was, the name attributed to him was Adam. The book attributed to him was Angel Raziel, which in translation actually refers to the hidden force of nature. That is a text that still exists to this day. And afterwards, there were many successors. And the greatest of which in this lineage was Abraham. And that's almost approximately 3,000 years later. He lived in ancient Babylon, and he was basically a person who was taking care of the Babylonian public. But what happened was an eruption of the force of human egoism in that society in Babylon. And they started getting into more and more social conflicts that was represented by that medley of languages and that confusion that emerged between them. That was during the rulership of King Nimrod. Abraham was like a researcher who tried to see what was the problem, what was the reason for the conflict. They had agriculture, they had their crops, they had their fish, they had everything they needed to have in order to live well. But then, all of a sudden, conflicts arose, feuds, division. And he was looking at the social situation, and what he realized was that human nature is evolving. The human ego was growing. They didn't have that level of development before. And then he realized that as he continued his research, he understood that the only way is to transcend that human ego, to rise above it. And when we do that, we begin to be sensitive to another force in nature, to the opposite force. And that teaches us how nature works as a system and what it actually wants from human beings. And that was the teaching that he gave to those Babylonians. He was talking about rising above the various differences and issues and conflicts that came from the eruption of the human ego, and the people who were sensitive to his message joined him. And as many of his successors and students wrote after him, what he did was he brought people together according to this teaching, and he called that group, he called it Israel. Israel comes from a combination of two words, Yashar El, which means directly towards that higher force of nature. There is a negative force that appears and evolves between human beings, and then there is a positive force that they need to discover. And if they're capable of building such a social system that works with both of these forces, positive and negative, then they can find the general plan and program of nature and how it works with human beings to evolve them. So this is what he discovered, and the people who joined him from all of the Babylonian kingdom was a group that was later called Israel. It's not the Israel of today, but that's how it was called. They maintained that higher human connection. Their maxim or their slogan was love covers all differences and all crimes. But that refers to the evolution of that group. Later on, the ruler of Babylon, King Nimrod, expelled them from the Babylonian kingdom, and they went towards the land of Canaan. Then there's already the demise of Abraham and his students that continued that path, and they went through their own evolution. There's the Egyptian part of it as well, that part of the story. But what they worked on was constantly maintaining their human connection, their higher connection, until they found themselves in the land of Israel, land of Canaan. And when they started building their society here, their conflicts began to happen again, just like it happened in Babylon. But that same group once again began to evolve negatively. And that brought to a ruin of that society, to a destruction. This was symbolized as the ruin of the first temple. And then they went to an exile, and they started building their connection again. And again, the symbol of it is the second temple. And they maintained it for a short time, but because the human ego continues to evolve continuously in human beings, they ultimately couldn't hold on to it. And even though they were able to produce a lot of texts back then about their inherent connection in its coded language, but they couldn't hold on to that connection, and then that second destruction happened, which was approximately 2,000 years ago. Since then, they lost their connection altogether and dispersed across all the nations of the world, and that's the reality to this day. Now, what's happening here? What's happening is that this group essentially carries a method, a system for human connection. And that method, over time, needs to spread across all of humanity. This has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with anything besides the inherent human connection. This is what the original sources of Kabbalah are actually talking about. That includes the book of Zohar and even sources that come before that, 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, including the book of Yetzirah, that is attributed to Abraham more or less 3,500 years ago. All these books are actually talking about is that system of human connection, how to properly connect human beings. Throughout history, humanity keeps suffering because of the growth of the human ego, which doesn't allow people to create social harmony, and also doesn't allow them to recognize the greater force of nature, that integral force of the natural system. That's why human beings cannot sense it. And so humanity it has an inherent demand, a deep-seated demand towards that group. It seems to humanity that there is this sentiment towards this group that somehow that group holds the keys to social happiness and even to truth. And yet it holds it and doesn't spread it. And that inherent sentiment, that demand towards the Jewish people, which seems irrational, it has an origin and it has a reason that is embedded in nature. And it's because that group carries a method for how to bring human beings together and to recognize their system of connection. And that is something that will enable a whole different level of life on this planet. But also, because when humanity begins to work with both positive and negative forces, it begins to recognize the higher system of nature, the greater system that motivates the evolution of the human being towards higher levels of understanding and feeling of all of reality, an expansion of human perception. And so that sentiment and that deep-seated demand towards the Jews is real. It's there. The issue is that most Jews have no idea about this, because until about 500 years ago, the wisdom of Kabbalah was completely hidden. And it was only the Ari, the holy Ari, who was a very special Kabbalist who lived in the 16th century. He disclosed the wisdom of Kabbalah and adapted it for that generation. He rewrote it in a more modern and, so to say, scientific language. He wrote a lot. And since that point in time, the wisdom of Kabbalah began its reappearance. I lead an organization that teaches and shares the wisdom of Kabbalah, the authentic wisdom of Kabbalah, with everyone. Everyone in all languages, without any differences. Because since that point in time, that wisdom needs to be disclosed to everyone, and it's permitted to disclose it to everyone, because it's essentially the natural system of connection between human beings. And it should assist humanity in our time to reach a higher level of connection, which will take us to a whole other level of human existence and a whole different understanding of the laws of nature. So that's kind of a summary of the origin of the wisdom of Kabbalah. The wisdom of Kabbalah goes into great detail about all the system and the structure of reality, how this world is completely operated by deeper causal levels and, so to speak, worlds that exist. And it obviously has to do with all of mankind, with everyone, and it should be used for the benefit of all mankind. And there are no more secrets. There's nothing hidden anymore. The problem is that people, and mostly the Jewish people, have nothing to do with the wisdom of Kabbalah today. They mostly engage in nonsense, and that's why today, it is a time when most of humanity develops this demand towards the Jewish people, and a sense that they're hiding something, keeping something, but they themselves don't know what it is. And we, as people who understand it, are trying to publicize it and explain it to the world. We're trying. I don't know if we're so successful, but what I want to add is that I understand where anti-Semitic sentiments come from, and I see it as a natural response in the human network. It is something that can cease and subside only on the condition that the Jews will reveal that method of connection that exists in the wisdom of Kabbalah and disclose it to all, as this book of Zohar writes about it and all the other Kabbalistic sources. Well, that's a brief introduction or summary.
quite amazing. I have to come back to this world for a moment. I thought I was listening to His Holiness the Dalai Lama in disguise. when Dr. Laitman so clearly expounded the essentials of the wisdom of Kabbalah, I tended constantly to translate this message back into Tibetan and into Sanskrit and into Greek. It seems that we shall be the idea of transcending the ego and attaining a level of more general human understanding would have been expressed in two terms in the sort of Buddhism represented by His Holiness Dalai Lama. You have to go beyond the ego. It is called in Sanskrit ahamkara, to do ego doing. And it is quite true that you might say this of numerous peoples, not just the Jews today, but they're far too much fixed on the ego. And you have to have a broader, deeper mentality that encompasses, perhaps we can say, mankind. But there's much to do for mankind to rise about the lower levels of the ego to a higher understanding. This is really Indian Buddhism. Now, when Dr. Laitman brings us back 6,000 years to Adam and his wife, perhaps Eve, and then 3,000 years later, approximately, to Abraham, eventually to Moses, then I hear echoes from the Indian side, especially with Abraham. And Abraham has two spellings in our own tradition, Abraham. And in India, we have Brahma and Brahma. There is some sort of relationship. The chronology is, to my mind, desperate. When I hear the figures 6,000 and 3,000, I tend to look at these figures more from a mythological perspective than a really chronological, historical. But right now, it's not the time to disagree about that. Perhaps we want to, Dr. Laitman pointed out that the wisdom of the Kabbalah came to the West approximately 500 years ago. And you kindly sent me a few references to some scholars whose name are associated in Europe with the term Kabbalah. An early Spanish author would be Raymond Urlul. But most interesting is Reuchlin, a humanist around 1500. And he says, very interestingly, that I am a student of Pythagoras. And Pythagoras was the wise man, the first philosopher. But he learned his wisdom from the Jews. This is Reuchlin's idea. Later on, it's repeated by others, such as Leibniz. Now, where in the world we must ask this question, where in the world did Reuchlin get this idea that Pythagoras had learned from the Jews? And I did a little research into this, and it has to do with Byzantium. That from Byzantium was conquered by the Turks, as we know, and Greek scholars would flee to Italy, to Florence. And one of these would be Gemistos Plato, not Plato, but Plato. And he brought the tradition that the Jews had influenced the Pythagoreans. Now, that is an old myth that can be traced back to Alexandria. So there is this idea that the wisdom of the Greeks came from the Jews. And a parallel to this is the myth of Plato, the head of the academy, himself the student of Socrates, was a Moises atitson, to say in Greek. That is, he was a Moses who spoke Greek. Now, I don't think you will be able to persuade any Greek scholar or any classical scholar that this is historically correct, that Plato, so to speak, studied with Moses. That's very difficult. We have no trace of the Jews being known to the Greek historians, which would be natural had this 6,000 and 3,000 years chronology been really historically true. It may be mythically true, but historically it's very difficult. Herodotus does not know the Jews. But as far as I'm aware, the earliest mention of the Jews among the Greeks is to be found in a fragment of Aristotle. And I think here's some very interesting, it opens some very interesting perspectives, namely that according to Aristotle, the Jews were originally Indian philosophers. That is a very interesting question. Was Aristotle right? There are Egyptian connections, we know for sure. But this idea about Indian philosophers, well, it does seem to have some sort of support with the Abraham, the Brahma, the wife of Abraham, Sarah, the wife of Brahma, Sarasvati, and so on and so forth. Actually, Adam even could be traced also back to Indian sources. But let us try to fix on this common point. I agree that Kabbalah is a sort of wisdom. And it, in a way, Reuchlin was right when he said that it has to do with Greek philosophy. There are connections for sure. But not only so, I mentioned His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and it is true, what is one of my discoveries actually, to see that philosophy was known in India too after the advent of Alexander the Great. The Greeks came with Alexander and they imported and brought Greek philosophy to India. So for sure, Dr. Laitman is right in emphasizing this Kabbalah wisdom, the essence of which is to transcend ego and narrowness and all sorts of human weakness and vices. And there is a path. There's a systematic path. And it has to do with something that I'm sure Dr. Laitman is very profoundly into, namely numbers. As we all know, the Pythagoreans, who developed philosophia, philosophy, claimed all things are or have numbers. That is quite fundamental to the Pythagorean wisdom. And it is also fundamental to Kabbalah. I think we briefly discussed this, and we don't want to go too much into numbers, I suppose. But the number of the term Kabbalah is, when you count in the Hebrew, it is 137. And when you look up, you'll see that even in modern physics, that the number 137 plays an enormous role in philology and in natural sciences. Scholars such as Wolfgang Pauli and Richard Feynman define perhaps, Richard Feynman once says that the number 137, that is the number of the term Kabbalah, may have been written by the finger of God. So that's very interesting, that there seems to be some sort of connection between ancient wisdom and modern natural sciences, a path that must and has to be explored further. So 137. I should also mention one of the greatest of all Kabbalists of all time, known to and yet not known to Christians, Jesus. What? Yes, he too was a rabbi, so we can speak about Rav, Jesus. It is one of the most important observations of modern New Testament theology that the numbers of words and syllables in the Greek New Testament has been counted minutely just as the number of the syllables in the Hebrew Torah has been counted by the Sofarim, the wise rabbis through the centuries. Why? That is because, in a certain way, Jesus is not just a Kabbalist, a great Kabbalist, but he too is a Pythagorean. A Pythagorean defined as one who is fascinated by numbers and by counting. God counts. God is the great geometrician, according to Plato. Gematry in Hebrew. So this, to summarize this, I would say very broadly, in full agreement with Dr. Laitman, that we have to somehow transcend the ego and all our bad habits, our ignorance, our greed. Greed is not good, as some people would say. Greed is very, very bad, because greed and hatred are some of the things that really bring us down on a low level, where we do not have this deeper insight into numbers and into geometry, gematria. There are, in Judaism, we have, of course, 32 rules of interpretation, somehow deeply involved with numbers. So numbers and theology for some of the Greeks, religion, theology, geometry, mathematics, much the same thing. So Kabbalah wisdom, deep to a very large extent, has to do with theology in the sense of geometry. And I think the idea, it's a valid idea. If you do geometry, study geometry, then you don't harm other people at the same time. It is a good way to go beyond the ego when you're profoundly, as I have been doing for the last 20 years, day and night, going into the ancient numbers and the ancient philosophy of numbers. That is the philosophy of Plato. Yeah.
So okay, I heard a lot of things from
you heard a lot of things,
Laitman and Dr. Lindner, and just to maybe put some order into some things and a little bit on topic. I mean, it is fascinating, but maybe Dr. Laitman, can you make the connection between Kabbalah, Buddhism, Greek philosophy, the Jews? What are we? Is this historical accuracy? Is it important to understand the problem today? How are they connected? Maybe these wisdoms you can explain to us.
I would say this. First of all, surely in the past, all of those nations were a lot more interconnected, even a lot more than today. Science was sort of was shared by all. Wisdom was shared by all. The foundations of the wisdom of Kabbalah, since the time of Adam, for 20 generations they were open for his students. And then there were 20 generations between Adam and Abraham until it started spreading in Babylon, which was the cradle of human civilization. However, when Abraham taught and shared his wisdom, the wisdom of Kabbalah, with the Babylonians, it is said that he sent some students to the land of Kedem, which actually refers to India. And it is symbolized as gifts, meaning he sent some of the students to India with gifts of the wisdom. And so since then, from about 3,500 years, that wisdom also exists in certain forms in these areas. India, Nepal, and these are the areas, the way that we recognize them today. That's with regards to the connection to Eastern teachings and India specifically. With regards to the Greek wisdom, I can say just one thing. The ancient Greeks, they learned the wisdom of Kabbalah as students back in the time of the prophets, meaning that is more or less, say, the 7th century BC, before Common Era, meaning about 2,700 years ago, they studied the wisdom of Kabbalah in Israel of the time, of back then. Then they also absorbed it as there was the conquering of Israel. There was a complete mixture between the Greek culture and the Jewish culture. And they learned it, they absorbed it that way as well. And so philosophers from the medieval, more or less, times, like Laitman and others, who write that the Greek received their wisdom from the Jews, it goes back even to the time of the prophets, meaning about 2,700 years ago. So the wisdom of Kabbalah was hidden until the time, more or less the time of the Ari. Again, it's not 100% like that. It was revealed here and there a little bit, but the character who reopened the wisdom of Kabbalah was in the 16th century, the Ari. And since then, it was adapted for the study of everyone, for everyone's knowledge, to share with all. And then, as much as the Greek were able to learn from it in those times as well, in medieval times, and also philosophers, European philosophers, they still didn't have sufficient attainment of it and sources of it. And that's why the wisdom of Kabbalah was still, let's say, half concealed. Only from the 16th century onwards, the wisdom of Kabbalah started to become revealed again. Also, philosophy, the word itself, is in a way a translation of Kabbalah, and I think Laitman even mentions that. And so that's what I would say. My hope is that today, after all of these historical processes, we are now facing major challenges because we're in a natural system that is pushing humanity to a higher level of connection, and if we won't comply with it, we will explode human society with the growth of the human ego. And that's why we have to start recognizing what the wisdom of Kabbalah teaches us about unity of mankind and rising above the ego, and pressure that Jewish people, that group, everyone who wants to, of course, but especially pressure that group to rediscover that wisdom and open it and share it with everyone. And that's their function in the human system. And that's the only way we will see anti-Semitism subsides as well. And that will clarify to people why they have that sentiment towards the Jewish people. And they'll understand what's going on here. And also, we too will understand, meaning those who belong to that group of Israel and those who don't. We will understand what are the Jews. The Jews are not a nation. They're not a nation. If you can say that all the other nations come from, say, a maternal figure and a paternal figure that later evolved as a culture, as a society, each and every nation can sort of go back to its genealogical roots. It's not the same with the Jews. The Jews can't trace their genes that way because they originated as a spiritual group. Abraham collected. He toured all of Babylon and told everyone there, those who want to rise above human ego and see the future in human connection, come with me. And so he took all people and representatives from all those nations, from all those groups that existed in ancient Babylon. And ancient Babylon was then sort of a focus of human civilization. Most of human civilization was there back then. And so the people of Israel are actually a collection of representatives from all of humanity, from most of humanity, from all those groups and clans and tribes who didn't have a gene-based connection. biological connection. Later on, that biological connection was made over the generation as well. But that initial connection was through the concept of love thy friend as thyself. They became a group based on their connection created above the human ego. But as soon as they stopped maintaining that connection, they scattered. And that's what we see as a characteristic of the Jewish people. The moment they are not pressured from outside, from other nations, from the world, when there is no hatred towards them, they scatter and they stop caring about each other. And that's because they don't have an inherent natural connection like the other nations. They only have a spiritual root. So if they hold on to it, they keep together as a group. And if not, they lose their connection because they can only maintain it through their spiritual connection. That's the thing about this group. Look at today. You have Jews scattered all over the world, and if not for the hatred and animosity towards them that increases every day, they would completely forget that they belong to anything common, and they wouldn't care about each other at all. And so, in this sense, anti-Semites are actually guarding preserving the people of Israel.
But I'm interested, if this wisdom was shared by, as also Dr. Lindner points out, and I'm not even going to go into the details of who gave what to whom, but if it was shared by the Greeks, by the Indians, Nepalese, how come that attitude doesn't exist today from the world to these people? Nobody comes to the Greeks today or to the Indians and say, please correct the world, what are you doing? But yet to this group of 0.2% of humanity, that group, suddenly all eyes are on that group.
Well, Buddhism speaks from the earliest times that there are three poisons: the poison of ignorance, the poison of desire, and the poison of hatred. And even Socrates asks this question, that the first evil, the first lie is ignorance. So the question is really, how do we overcome ignorance and thereby also hatred and desire? That is really the basic question also for Dr. Laitman, as I understand. How does ignorance come into the world? It is there for sure. Would Dr. Laitman agree with me that ignorance is a fundamental evil? It is much the same as too much ego.
Yes, of course. However, still correcting it can be done only by making greater connection between us. By everyone nullifying oneself towards the others, we can come to such a connection where what exists in one pours into the other. And in this way, even if we don't have a lot of wise men, the whole world is built like this pyramid, where the people who possess wisdom and sensitivity towards knowledge and wisdom and understanding of reality, there are few. But still, if the right connection is maintained, it is shared by all. So ignorance is definitely a plague in the world, especially in our time. We're making ourselves dumber, using our technologies in these ways as well, tools that are supposed to help us expand our wisdom and expand our knowledge and share our wisdom of how to perceive reality. And instead, as long as it's ruled by the human ego, we deal with it like little kids, and we only propagate nonsense. So I definitely agree, ignorance is a major problem. Let's hope that we will come to a state these days where people will begin to realize that we're in a global, integrated world. We live in a network that is run by definite, absolute forces of nature. It's like a sphere that is integrated, and it includes all the laws of nature. And so, if we make of ourselves something that is in similarity to that system, then we can begin to achieve harmony with the rest of nature, and we can begin to work reciprocally with the laws of nature, so that we can begin to absorb the wisdom of nature. And this puts us above those limitations of time and space and motion, and makes us similar to the eternity of nature, and it's possible.
Dr. Laitman, now and then, I agree. Dr. Laitman now and then uses the term harmony, a good Greek term. And it is a Pythagorean term also, harmonia in Greek. And all words, according to Pythagoras, are also numbers. And here's something very interesting about the term harmonia. I believe I'm the first to point it out. That you figure out the number of the word by adding A-R-M-O-N-I-A. And that adds up to 272. 1, 2. Now, 272 is very interesting, because 272 is what you get when you multiply the golden ratio 1618 by 1681. The 4 golden digits 1618 times, or 1618 times 1681. The 2 last digits have shift place. The Pythagoreans must have known, because they are so interested in the golden ratio, they must have known that the term harmonia itself is an expression of the harmony of the 4 golden digits, right? So in a way, in the deeper sense, when you use the term harmonia, I translate it into numbers. And that is constantly what we have to do, translate words into numbers. And that is a definition also of Revelation 13:18. Hode he Sophia estin. Here is wisdom. Let the man who has intelligence or wisdom, se fitzato, let him count the numerical value of the number of man. For the number of man, I avoid the Greek here, is 666, right? That again is a direct translation of a Buddhist text. So what we are seeing is that these people, just like Dr. Laitman quite correctly said, that in the old times there were some deeper historical connections, relationships between the peoples. To us today, still rather obscure, but evidently opening a very fascinating field of future study. These future studies, let me emphasize that, does require linguistic skills in Greek, in Latin, in Hebrew, Aramaic, and in Sanskrit and in Pali, and also in geometry, Greek geometry. That is the key to really fruitful future studies. And as we both of us have already mentioned, even in modern times, like Richard Feynman and Wolfgang Pauli and others have pointed out, the number of 137, the figure 7 is mentioned 137 times in the book of Revelation, proving that these people knew also Kabbalah. So here we have what Plato says, that in the end, theology, higher wisdom, and mathematics or geometry tend to find themselves in harmony in 272, that is somehow linked together with a golden ratio. So there's a unity in all this.
Dr. Laitman, I'm sure by now people are wondering
what is going on. Yes.
What is the language of Kabbalah? I mean, I know that Kabbalah doesn't necessarily speak of this world, it speaks of relationships, but I hear the significance of numbers as Dr. Lindner describes it. What is that language of Kabbalah? How does it work to describe
Kabbalah? The language of Kabbalah can be explained in a simpler way. Our world is actually a system that went through a deliberate shattering. It's like when you buy a puzzle for a child and you break it to pieces so that he needs to assemble it. So in a similar way, that one force, that unique force of nature, created a system. This is something that the books of Kabbalah explain in detail and in a lot of elaboration and so on, but I'll summarize it. So there's a creation of a system that was shattered, and we have to reassemble it in order to discover the mind of the creator of the system. And when we do that by assembling the pieces, which means coming together, and that's not just us, it's all the levels, all the layers of the universe, that puts all of those layers in harmony, that word which Dr. Lindner really appreciates. So So that's essentially what we are, the process that we're in. It's only about coming to the right connection according to the system. But for that, we have to study the system that we're in. And the whole wisdom of Kabbalah divides to the study of the structure of all of the worlds, our world, the still vegetative and animate and human levels of this world, and how they exist in this form, in the current form, and what form they need to reach. And also the process, how to move from the present state to the desired state, the future state. This is termed in Kabbalah the final correction. And this is a process that we study, and we need to implement it. The problem, again, is that there is this group that carries the method, possesses the method, and it needs to enable it in order to have all of humanity share it as well. And so all the problems that we're seeing, and the troubles and conflicts and anti-Semitism, all of this is in order to push that group to fulfill its function instead of spending its efforts in controlling banks and media and other things. And so the wisdom of Kabbalah explains all of this. I'll be happy to send Dr. Lindner books and materials. Besides that, where we make efforts to put everything online and in free access to everyone in many languages. I think almost 40 languages. We're making efforts to disseminate this knowledge. And so the problem that we're facing is really how to awaken that group called the people of Israel and explain to them that all the negative pressures that they feel from the world and in general are pushing them to their role, to their necessary role in the system. Unfortunately, I don't have that much success influencing these people, and feel rather helpless in this regard. But the state of the world, in the meantime, is deteriorating. And according to the wisdom of Kabbalah, and also this is something we can see in our eyes today, that everything is becoming worse and the situation is more and more threatening. My hope is that we'll be able to share this wisdom of correction and connection between everyone and begin to reconnect as an integrated system that is in similarity with the general integral system of nature and will go into harmony between us and the surrounding nature and will become a single system, a unified system. That's the purpose of the wisdom of Kabbalah in essence.
Very good. I fully appreciate what you're saying. An integrated system, I'm already translated at the back of my head into Pali, Patidya Samutpada, integrated system. I really encourage you to go on, and your efforts are really much appreciated.
Dr. Laitman, just before we close it, because I have to ask it, because it sounds like we find this is Dr. Laitman. We find all these similarities, these ideas that circulate all around. And you said that Jews are not a genetic nation; they're an assembly of people from all other nations that then went into exile multiple times. Are we going to see maybe additional Jewish people who are not the Jews that people think of when they close their eyes? wake up in India, in Greece, and around the world and bringing these ideas forward? Or is it going to be only this?
Oh, that's not an issue. A Jewish person means Yehudi from the word Yichud, unity. That's what it means. That's the true meaning of the word. It only represents a person's inner inclination in life. What is their purpose? What do they aspire for? And if a person does not aspire to this, then he's not a Jew. That's the actual definition. Same thing with the word Israel. Israel comes from the word Israel, which is two words, Yashar El, which means one whose inclination is Yashar, straight, directly, to El, to that higher force of connection and love. The same thing as it is expressed in love thy friend as thyself. That's the rule of reality. It doesn't have anything to do with what we call Jews or Israel. And today, the way we are today is we can't actually be considered Jews or Israel. Let's hope we will, though.
What an idealistic view of Judaism. I love it.
Okay. Unfortunately, it's our time is up. A lot more questions, but really, thank you, Dr. Lindner, Dr. Laitman, for your time. I feel like we just scratched the tip of this iceberg. But everyone, please like, share, comment below if you have questions. Maybe we can have another conversation and reveal more of these hidden connections in nature. Thank you very much. See you, everyone.